Well, thanks for tuning in. Today we're going to look at some 18th century 32-pounder cannons. Now these are Armstrong pattern guns. The later ones were Bloomfields that have the sort of eye holes in them for the rope, for the breeching, which was the sort of absorb the shock of the recoil. They've all got the pattern, you can see that GR, so that's George Rex, King George, and Rex being king, of course, in Latin, Tyrannosaurus Rex, King Lizard, and the second in this case. And the royal insignia really does look the part. The arrow, you can see the broad arrow, that's the proofing mark. That means they were charged with double their normal sort of gunpowder charge, and if they didn't blow up, they were proofed down at Woolwich Arsenal. That, you see that hole there? That's the sort of vent, known as the vent, and that's where they would put the put the fuse in or whatever to light them. And these rings, can you see the rings on them? These are sort of ornate rings. They're the reinforcing rings. The first ring at the back is known as the base ring, and then the thinner rings are the reinforcing rings. So you've got the first reinforcement, the second reinforcement. Now you can see the trunnions, and the trunnions are what enabled this to pivot in the gun carriage. And each trunnion has a maker's mark on it, and some of them indeed have a serial number too. If we look at the back, we're now at the back of the breeching, so that overall cast cable, as it's called, at the back of the gun is in the Armstrong patterns. Can you see that curve there? That's an Ogie curve apparently, which is a serpentile type curve that's part of the Armstrong pattern shape for the breech. That's the back of the gun, and you can see the vent at the top there. You see that's where the fuse would have gone in originally to light the cannon, which would have been black powder fired even. Big old lumps, mind, good 2 tons. What's left of these, but originally they'd have been nearly 3 metric tons. Interestingly, the first cast iron cannon in Britain, at least, was commissioned by a Mr. William Levitt, a clergyman in the 1500s, and ended up creating quite an empire, really, of producing cannons for King Henry VIII, none less, who was very keen on iron cannons because, although they tended to blow up quite a bit, they were loads cheaper than the bronze version, and he could see that the more you had, the better it was, really. Most of the cannons that were produced in the sort of Sussex area furnaces were used for the Royal Navy, and weight's really important on ships. You need to know how heavy things are. We can decipher this. The first number is 57. That's the number of hundredweights. Now, a hundredweight was 112 pounds in those days. The second digit is the number of quarter hundredweights, and the third one is the number of pounds remaining. And you put those together and you come to an enormous amount of poundage. Some nearly 6,000 pounds in weight. The bottom cannon here is from the Breed furnace, and that suffered that area, or the whole area, suffered a drought in 1743. These cannons were made, of course, from cast iron, which came from iron ore that had been heated using charcoal with air blown over it from enormous bellows. These bellows were powered by water wheels. And in 1743, there was a drought in the Breed area where this cannon on the right was made, and people had to then keep the production going. They had to stand in the water wheel and tread it, and that's where the word treadmill comes from. It was literally coined back in those days in the cannon manufacturing. So they ended up building balancing ponds to make sure that even if water ran a bit low, they could keep production going all through peaks. So very interesting history on these things. And in fact, they were bored out using horse-powered lathes. They were cast solid in the end because it was much easier to cast them solid and then bore them out. And that's, you see that mark there on the right? That's the that's where they would have been fixed in one of those enormous lathes back in the day. Anyway, that's where a rope would have gone round the breeching to help catch the enormous recoil from one of these things. A million foot-pound muzzle energy. Perspective, a 44 Magnum produces about 1,000 foot-pound of muzzle energy. Here's a interesting one. That's a maker's serial number. So that's not the maker's mark, that's a serial number. That would have been number 34, because we didn't produce 34-pound guns, we produced 32-pound guns. So it's actually the number of that gun. They were pretty reliable in use and were known as the old guns, because these ones lasted the test of time. Now this cannon's got some elevation markings for when it was on the carriage to get that sort of angle correct, depending on what distance you're aiming the cannon at, and you'd be looking down there or across the astrodal, I think that's called. Still some few markings there, look, probably the weights, but pretty worn out now, not like the other one. Anyway, Moving swiftly on, we now get to the last bit really of this video, and that's the maker's marks. Now, if you look on the trunnions of cannons, they've always got a maker's mark. There's one. That stands for Rose Fuller. Now, if I flip this the other way so we can read it, there you go. This is Rose Fuller, and it was one of the famous ironworks, and it was named after this chap, Mad Jack Fuller, or Honest Jack Fuller, as he liked to call himself. Anyway, like a lot of those sort of 17th and 18th century characters, lots of history about, what they were up to, not only making money from arms, but slavery and other things. But there you are. History can be pretty grim at times, but, as are these cannons. I mean, we did use them in the War of in Independence, America's War of Independence against us. Well, we didn't use the 32-pounders, actually, when one of our ships sort of saddled up to fight with USS Constitution. It only had 24-pounders, and they weren't able to damage the size of that ship. It was so well put together in the American construction, and it's American oak, which was denser than our oak. The cannonballs bounced off it, and it got the nickname Old Ironsides. Anyway, we were royally defeated, and of course the rest is history. Just as well they didn't have my 32-pounders, it might have been a bit different. In all seriousness, what were we thinking? Do you know one interesting fact? There's two Declarations of Independence. The Americans have got one, but of course we've got the other one because it was a contract. We both had a copy. I think ours is stored very safely somewhere in the National Archives. Anyway, the next thing, just to point out before I go, cannons made two other important contributions. One is, I think, the first understanding that work equaled heat, and heat is energy, was from boring cannons because they got hot, and that's quite important, as it turns out, for the Industrial Revolution that then followed. And standardisation. We take standardisation for granted. It's what builds things and cars and fixes things and screws and nuts and bolts, another big important part of the modern world. The need to standardise cannons construction so different people like these Sussex iron foundries could make patents, make a cannon to a correct pattern that would then use with a standard shot, was also a sort of pre-runner to the greater Industrial Revolution. So they did play their part in history, not always the best parts, because sometimes they were subjugating people and not just used for the defence, sadly. But that's their part of parcel of history, isn't it? It's not always what we want it to be written. It's what it is. But if you've made it this far, thanks so much. Really do appreciate those sort of watchers that sort of get to the end. Any watchers is appreciated, but if you have got to the end, then you're very special. So much appreciated. And look, just to say, thanks very much. If you're willing to like the video and subscribe, it is appreciated. It does help them get shared a bit more on YouTube. So thanks very much for your time, and hope to catch up again soon.